Okay, students, good morning. I have started the recording. Can you hear me, students?
Yes, sir.
Okay. So yesterday we were going through this procedure of DNS, how DNS resolves the IP address which is necessary to connect with a remote computer for a host computer from which connection is being tried. So we saw that these names of computers actually follow on the internet follow a hierarchical system. They are separated into different non-overlapping domains, and then there is a hierarchy. It's a tree-like structure where to get the full name of a computer to which you want to connect to on the internet, you have to traverse from the leaf node towards the root node of the tree. The example that we were seeing was a computer called robot.cs.washington.edu, and the root domain name is actually denoted by a dot. However, in actual names, it is usually never shown. Now to connect to this, the local domain name server whose IP address is known to the machine is first queried. A DNS query is made to it in a particular format. We will come to it. What is the packet that for a DNS query, packet format for a DNS query? The important thing to understand here is that the local DNS server, without disturbing the originating request, takes care of answering this query if required by contacting the root name servers at the very top of the root node of the naming tree and down towards the leaf node whose name has been asked for. So in this example, it might first ask a root name server who has information about the about the .edu domain name server. Then it contacts the .edu domain name server, which gives it information about Washington.edu domain. Then it contacts the University of Washington name server, which gives it information about the cs.washington.edu domain. And finally, it contacts the authoritative name server of the cs.washington.edu domain to get the full IP address of the computer robot.cs.washington.edu. The first root name server IP address has to be known to the local name server. There are not too many such root name servers distributed geographically around the world. Not too many in a sense that less than 20 probably. They contain identical information and they are updated. However, they need not be updated that often, luckily, because if you look at this hierarchical tree structure, the first level domains, Aero.com, Edu, Gov, Museum, ORG, Net, and then the country domains, these do not come up and spring up very commonly. Okay, so these are not things that will every day new one will be invented. It is not like that. So luckily that root level name servers do not need to be modified that often, which is lucky. Otherwise, it would have been difficult. Okay, now two questions need to be answered and we will answer them one after the other. First of all, what is the format of these queries? And secondly, what are the answers of these queries? Okay, or how do they get the answer to these queries? This we will now get some information. The answers to this query is probably is not the correct word. What we will look at is the database, DNS databases at these different servers. which is returned in the form of answers to the queries. The queries and the answers themselves are in the form of DNS packets. These PNS packets follow, the DNS follows a connectionless protocol, transport layer protocol called UDP. UDP is a very simple transport layer protocol, much simpler than TCP, the one that we will study in very detail. UDP does not maintain any state information about the connection among its the two different parties. It does not give any reliability information. Okay, does not mandate that the packet will be delivered in order. Still, why is this used in DNS? It is used in DNS because most of the DNS messages actually are usually up to 512 bytes. Okay, so that is a usually most commonly up to 512 bytes, and these very comfortably it fits within a UDP datagram, which is usually up to 4096 bytes. Okay, the IP datagrams can be larger, but this TCP datagrams might be of different size, but this UDP datagrams is 4096 bytes. 512 bytes, as you can guess, very comfortably sits in this. These are all upper limits. Okay, and what happens if because UTP messages might get lost, and say you have the originator has asked a DNS query, but there is no answer from the name server. As I mentioned yesterday, the originator keeps a timer. If within the certain amount of time there has been no response from the local name server, it gives up the query and it might ask again, or the local name server might itself send a reply back saying that it could not find the information it is being looked for. So here the application itself, the application which initiated the DNS query itself takes care of getting the answer finally, okay, from the local name server. Okay, similarly, the local name server might also not get any answer from the other name servers. If it doesn't get within a certain time, it repeats the query. This is how it works. So resolvers are actually programs that extract the information from the name server. Now, how is this information on name servers stored, which eventually is answered in the form of some DNS packets that we will now see. Now, every domain has a set of resource records associated with it, which is the DNS database. Okay, so you do not need to understand everything. You you just probably need to remember these 3 or 4. First is this the address of the host A, then MX, NS, CNAME, and PTR. I will come to them one after the other. Domain resource records usually has a domain name, then there is a time to leave field, then there is a class, then there is a type, and then there is a value. Let me give an example to make you understand. The most common domain resource record in the database is the first type, first one shown. Okay, there will be multiple such entries, but just consider the first one. This is called an A type record. These are the most common ones. This has a string, which is the name of the machine or the server. Then there is a time to leave field, time to leave, TTL, which is written here as 86,400. This means that this record at max remains valid for 86,400 seconds. after any other name server has retrieved this record, okay, they can trust it, but they should not trust it for more than 86,400 seconds because this information might have changed. So these records, why is this time to live field important? Because these records are cached in the local name server or maybe in the intermediate name servers. Whether you are going to maintain the cached records forever in your cache or they are not trustable, and after some time you must get the information again from the name server, that is the question. And after how much time should you get this information from the name server? That is also the question. So the name server says, okay, 86,400 seconds is a reasonable amount of time for which once you have cached it, maybe you can trust this record. But in the meantime, it can change also. For records which change very frequency, this number will be very small. This is in seconds. 86,400 basically means 1 day. Then the class of the record for our class, for the course that we are studying, this will always be in. This is to show that this is a record, I mean internet class record. Then is the type of the record. A is a normal IP address, IPv4 address. Okay. If it is 4 is AAA, then it is a IPv6 address, which is 128 bit. However, mostly we will study IPv4, which is a 32-bit address. Interestingly, these IP addresses, although we say 32-bit, they are always written into this dot decimal format, as you already know. But what is the interpretation of all these things we will study later on when we study IP addresses. So that is given. So overall, what does this A-type record mean? It means that the server cse.iitkgp.ac.in, this entire record can be trusted for 86,400 seconds. It is class IN record. Its type is the value field that is given is an IP address, and its value is this 203.110.245.250. This is dotted decimal. Okay, so this is also peculiar, but this is what is common, that the overall the string is binary, but usually it is written in dotted decimal format to make it easy for human beings to interpret this. Then is a CNAME type record. A CNAME type record or a canonical name record essentially shows an alias. Okay. For example, iitkgp.ac.in with a time to live field again 86,400 seconds is an in class record. It is a canonical name for www.iitkgp.ac.in, whose canonical name is www.iitkgp.ac.in. Okay. Then there is a so you do not need to type on your browser www.iitkgp.ac.in. You can type only iitkgp.ac.in, and you will find that you will be able to connect to www.iitkgp.ac.in also. The last one is a pointer type record. PTR type record is a pointer type record. This is very interesting. These are not always present, but they might be present. They perform the reverse duty of DNS. They are in DNS record, A-type records, traditional, more common records. You have the server name, and at the end you have the value of the IP address. In PTR type records, you first have the IP address and then have the server name. This is sometimes useful when you want to find out the name of the server corresponding to its IP address by something called reverse DNS lookup. So this procedure, if you want to perform ever, not in the regular traditional DNS, but in some other applications, sometimes you need to know the name of the server given its IP address. So this type of records help in that. There are certain standards of internet which specifies the technical details of internet. They specify that the PTR for every computer that is connected to the internet, there should be a PTR type record somewhere in some DNS database. That is actually not the case. This is not actually followed. So PTR records might not be present for all computers that are connected. Now let's see some sample DNS database. Comments are written starting with semicolon. So this is the authoritative DNS server entry for the domain cs.vu.nl. Okay. CS is computer science department. VU is VRI University or VJ University. I don't know how it's pronounced in Dutch. Dutch language. This is the university where this gentleman Professor Tannenbaum teaches actually. That's why probably he has given this. VRI University means free university. It's a university in Amsterdam in Netherlands. And .nl is the .Netherlands. It's the Netherlands domain. Now, first line says it is the start of authority. So start of authority basically means this is an authoritative record, and then some values are given for probably the other machines which have this authoritative database also, probably star boss, and some other numerical fields are given which are not that important. We don't need to know the details of each of them. Then there are two machines, one called Zephyr and the other called Top. These are mail servers. These are the computers which take care of the mail service in this domain. What is the mail service? We will come when we study how emails are handled later in this chapter. Okay. So there is a computer called zephyr.cs.vu.nl and a computer called top.cs.vu.nl. Their priorities are, I think, one Zephyr, two top means Zephyr has a higher priority, top has the second priority. Notice that in this case, the right hand side, the value fields are actually strings. We have not yet come to any numerical IP addresses yet. Then is a NS type entry which says that the name server for the domain cs.vu.nl, the authoritative name server is star is to be found in star. Star.cs.vu.nl is the authoritative mail server. Now, what is the address of star? What is the address of Zephyr? What is the address of boss? What is the address of top? Nothing is known till now. So now we start the A-type records for these computers. First is for star. So start.cs.vu.nl has a A-type record. This is the IP address 130.37.56.205. Then zephyr.cs.vu.nl has this. Top has this. www is a CNAME for start.cs.vu.nl, which means www.cs.vu.nl, the web page for the department, is essentially it is a canonical name for the server start.cs.vu.nl, which means that somebody could have typed http :/start.cs.vu.nl to try to connect to www.cs.vu.nl. Okay, we will see HTTP later on in today's class. The FTP server for this domain is handled by Zephyr. Okay, so the ftp.cs.vu.nl, FTP is the protocol used for file transfer, particularly file transfer, and that is being handled by zephyr.cs.vu.nl. Then there are other IP addresses. One machine that says there are 2 IP addresses. I'm not fully sure that what this exactly means. There is something called FLITS. It has 2 different IP addresses listed. One of them also can act as a mail server, and FLITS actually it can also it basically can also kind of flits.ch.mu.nl. It can act as mail servers, but it can depend on, it can resolve to 3 different computers. One is FLITS itself, the second is Zephyr, and the third is TOP. Then there is a computer called Robot, which has an A-type address, A-type entry, but it can also act as mail servers with Robot and Zephyr. Then there is some little sister LaserJet, etc. LaserJet is probably I mean, some computer which handles a LaserJet printer, etc.
Sir.
Now you can do NSLOOKUP command on any Unix type computer, including Mac OS X or Linux. You can run the NSLOOKUP command and particular website address, say www.washington.edu. Okay, so you will get some information. Okay, some non-authoritative answer, and if you want to, this is one of the name servers for IIT KGP. And if you want to go deep inside this, you should try the dig command, dig dig. So this is the display that might come up if you do dig www.tum.de. TUM is Technical University Munich. DE is Deutschland. Okay, Deutschland is basically Germany. So this is showing this is a university in Germany. Fine. So now there is this authoritative answer, etc. are coming. All these things they will show these records and some authoritative information records. And you will notice that the UDP packet is 4096 bytes. So UDP is much faster, and TCP, as it requires handshaking, maintenance of state, etc. This will take a lot of time. DNS, there is a typo here. This is actually DNS. DNS uses a cascading approach for name resolution, right? For every worst case, for every subdomain, it needs to contact a different name server. So with TCP, this would have been painfully slow. Okay, a message setup is connection setup is required in TCP. A very, very elaborate connection setup and connection taking down is required in TCP. That is avoided if you use UDP. And DNS requests and responses are usually small and they fit well within one UDP segment. Okay, and as I mentioned, that since UDP is not reliable, DNS reliability is ensured in the application layer. If after timeout, the DNS client again resends the request. By client here means the machine which is requesting information. Okay, so this client server terminology will be used for the rest of the course. So in this scenario, the computer which is requesting information from the name server, local name server, is a client. There can be several clients corresponding to several name servers. Fine. So that's more or less it. We will now move to how web pages are handled using the HTTP protocol, hypertext transfer protocol. Okay. Any questions before that, students?
Sir?
Yes.
Sir, you said about that PTR type records. So, is the PTR type record sent to the root servers? Otherwise, how will the reverse DNS lookup work? I mean, the
No,
server
it
means
is
a.root
not
servers
always
dot net
sent.
or something.
This is the PTR type record is actually not part of the DNS query process. The PTR type
Okay.
records are used in other applications. For example, they might be used in some forensics applications to find out the name of a actual name of a server whose there is where some investigation has got some IP address into question, and that might in turn bring up some issue about uh, the means some necessity has been felt to know the name of the server with this IP address. It is not part of the regular DNS operation. That's why I said that the PTR records might not exist even for many computers which are connected to the internet. For example, the example DNS database that was given, there was not a single PTR record for any server, which is absolutely fine. So the PTR type
Okay.
entry is not for the regular DNS process. Okay, it has some other use in some other applications. Okay,
Okay.
possibly network
And
security or those type of applications, not for this.
sir,
Means
if
you can
here I
survive without a PTR type record for a server. You
sir,
will
here I
it
see
will
that
work fine.
here sir, here I
Yes.
see
Anything
that
else?
here I see that there are two A type of record for fleets. So when I receive this DNS response, then which IP address should I choose?
I think they can try out both. One of them will work. Provided the first one doesn't work, then the second one will work, etc. I think what this basically means is that the fleet server can have two different IP addresses. So it can start with the first one. If it doesn't work, then it can start with the second.
Okay.
Sir,
Thank you, sir.
can you explain once again why UDP is not reliable?
Okay. uh, well, I'll try to explain. It is fully it is fully difficult to explain at this stage until we go to transport layer, but I will just try to explain with this diagram. Just concentrate on the local name server and this client fields.cs.view.nl. Okay, only these two computers. Forget about the rest of the name servers. In transport layer connectivity, there are two options. One is TCP and the other is UDP. Okay, I'll not even go into the full forms of these terms because see the networks course is full of all these acronyms. Okay, I mean you will not remember everything on we have just started the classes. So as time comes, you will find all these acronyms. So TCP and UDP are the two main choices. TCP for a transport layer connection between these two computers maintains state information. State information means when a computer fields.cs.view.nl wants to start talking with the local name server cs.view.nl and some other what is the local name server? Local name server is star. So probably this computer, this local name server is start.cs.vu.nl. When it starts talking with this, so one of the parties initiates a connection. For example, in telephone or in mobile phone, one party calls, right? He initiates the connection. Then when the call is received, the connection is set up, and from that point onwards, the two parties can talk with each other. Exactly similar thing happens in TCP. Now TCP maintains state information in a sense that there is an elaborate handshaking process at the beginning and at the end to start a connection and to end a connection, which happens at the protocol level. What are the details? We will come to it when the time comes when we study TCP. It is quite elaborate. Okay. It is not a one phase saying that I am requesting a connection, immediately connection starts. It is not like that. It is something like I am requesting a connection. Fields is asking this start.cs.vu.nl. Start.cs.vu.nl replies back saying, yes, I have received your connection request. And then fields.cs.vu.nl again replies back, says, yes, I have received, I acknowledge your connection request and I am allowing it, something like that. And then fields.cs.vu.nl replies back saying, yes, I have received your reply that you are okay with the connection request. So three messages might pass between the two parties just to set up the connection. Then the actual data information transfer starts. And both the parties keep track of how much data has been sent. What is the number of the next TCP segment, expected number. Every TCP segment that comes is acknowledged with a reply message. Yes, I have received segment number 1. Now you can send segment number 2. Yes, I have now received segment number 2. Now you can send segment number 3. And this happens in both the directions. Do you understand? This is a bidirectional communication that is going on between the two parties. So both the parties acknowledge both the received and the sending of messages. So it is a mind-bogglingly complicated actually. I mean, it's, well, you will eventually learn about it. You will get the hang of the thing. But at first sight, it is quite complicated. And of course, all of this has cost you have to pay for it, price you have to pay for it. That is the overhead. It is slow. All this maintenance of state information is very, very, very slow. Okay. For example, if you send again, let me give you a post office analogy. I don't know how many of you ever go to post office to post letters, but when we were kids, our parents and guardians often used to send us to send post office. Still now, sometimes maybe say once or twice in a year, I personally go to post office to post some documents which have to be sent by post. It is written that you have to be sent by post, sometimes official documents, etc. Applications, official documents for me or my family members, etc. Okay, sometimes you have to send some documents to some bank office or somewhere for which you have to send a post. Now, when you are sending documents via post, there are many options. One option is you just put a stamp on the envelope and drop it at the post office without what happened. Okay, whether the letter will reach the receiver or not, you are least bothered because the letter probably does not have too much of financial value, or anyway, it's just an informal letter. However, there are situations in a post office where you can explicitly request, I want an acknowledgement. So there is something called registered post. Okay, so you might have used or may not have used it. Speed post is much more common. Speed post gives you an ability to track whatever letter you have sent because they give you a tracking number, and on the India Post website, you can track how long your letter has reached or how far your letter has reached. Registered post is slightly different. Registered post is that there is an record in the post office about what happened with your letter. And they will tell you, if you ask them what happened to your letter, there will be a record of whether when it was delivered or not. Now there is a special type of registered post, even special type of speed post with acknowledgement, which is when the postman delivers the letter, he or she will take the signature of some receiving party. And this is most commonly happens with courier. Okay, or even say the Amazon or this type of e-commerce delivery, they might want to take a signature. And nowadays they will take e-signatures. But post office, I think, still takes ink signatures. Okay, so you have to write on a piece of paper. Wherever they ask you to sign, you have to sign, whoever is receiving the letter. This means that there is an acknowledgement, and this acknowledgement will then be delivered back to you saying that yes, somebody has received the letter. You know for certain that somebody has received the letter. So this is an acknowledgement that which guarantees that if the message has been delivered, you will get an acknowledgement. So the problem with TCP is that suppose you are sending a message from one side to the other, maybe the other side has received it, but the other side's acknowledgement has got lost on the way. If that happens, then the sending side thinks that the receiving side has not received the message and it resends the same message again. Now the receiving side maintains a state information which tells it that this is an old information which has already it has received. So it should not receive it this time, but it sends back an acknowledgement again because it understands the acknowledgement must have got lost on the way. So all these complications are there. It is quite complicated, takes up a lot of time. UDP makes no promise about whether the message will be delivered or not. No promise either to the sender or to the receiver. Nothing, no feedback, no promise, no order delivery. Right now we are talking over Teams. Video and audio data usually are encoded and transmitted using UDP connections. Because this is so much of traffic that TCP would have made the connection very, very slow and would have put too much burden on the computers through which we are accessing, we are right now connected. UDP on the other hand works fine because luckily voice, image, etc. these are types of information where a loss of certain amount of information, if some UDP packets get lost, is not a major problem because they have sufficient images and voice have sufficient redundancy so that the human mind can fill up parts of it, not completely. For example, if all the UDP packets corresponding to a complete sentence that I speak cannot reach you, you will not magically know what sentence I was going to speak. But I am talking of fractions of a second of voice which could not reach you, you will still have no difficulty in understanding what I was going to say. Because this is how the human brain works. So in those type of situations, UDP works fine. You have to understand things happen very fast in UDP and TCP domain. So what we think about as missing information, even if say 100 packets get lost, that might only be say 0.1 second or 0.2 seconds of data. That is not a major problem. Okay. Does that answer your query? And
Yes.
since DNS performs so many queries in the worst case with so many name servers, maintaining TCP connections with so many of them would have been a big headache for a DNS server. In addition, remember it has to handle many clients. Here only one client is shown, this fields.cs.vu.nl. That is not the only client. Probably 10,000 computers are trying to access the internet with depending on only one local name server. So it is already handling so many requests. It is remembering that I have to give an answer back to this particular client. Now again, it has to remember all the TCP connection details with so many other servers for so many other connections. It is a major problem. So that's why UDP is not used.
Thank you, sir.
Now next we will move to the web access using the HTTP protocol. First, let us a little bit of history. What is the internet? What is the web? As we say, how did it come up? Around the late 80s, in the European Center for Nuclear Research, or CERN, that's a place where thousands of scientists, engineers, technicians, etc. work collaboratively on nuclear research, right? So they constantly exchange reports, blueprints, drawings, photos, etc. It's a very complicated engineering and scientific project. Now there was this computer scientist Tim Berners-Lee. He is actually British. He came up with an idea called a hypertext, which is connected, which is a series of connected electronic documents. Okay, so you will open one document and then you click on one link that will open another document, etc. You can create static HTML, these hypertext pages on your computer also and link them, and just in locally you can play with it. Okay, many different software might be able to open HTML files. Okay, locally. You don't always need the internet to access HTML. For example, the Microsoft Word or any LibreOffice or anything, LibreOffice Writer or any such program might actually save the thing that you have written in a HTML format. It gives you an option, and it can also give you an option to publish it online immediately if you want. Now, side by side, this networking was also becoming popular. So Tim Berners-Lee also enabled these pages to be accessible over the network. Okay, so one computer could connect to another computer and access this. However, the access mechanism was not very easy. Some GUI-based intuitive interface was required to make it easy for normal people, day-to-day people who are not computer scientists or very technically sophisticated to access these documents. The first graphical interface browser was called Mosaic, was developed by Mark Anderson at University of Illinois in USA. Anderson later on went on to found Netscape Communications. This was the first big browser. Just the product primarily was a browser. I have used Netscape browser in the first computer I used, I remember, had a Netscape browser along with the Internet Explorer browser. So Netscape Navigator and Internet Explorer, these two were the main browsers. I think the Netscape company probably no longer exists. So this started browser war between the two companies. Okay. The advantage that Microsoft had was Microsoft started bundling the Internet Explorer browser with its own operating system, Windows. Okay. So try to understand that you had to pay money to buy the Netscape Navigator software. because free options like Chrome or Firefox was not there. Google probably hadn't yet been set up, or even if it had been set up, it had no product called Chrome. And Firefox also probably didn't, it didn't exist. So you needed to pay money for this, which basically killed, eventually it killed the business for Netscape actually. People stopped buying Netscape because they were getting a browser for free inside the Windows package. Okay, this killed Netscape business eventually and the company shut down. But they did launch a lawsuit, or they launched, or maybe the US government anti-monopoly, they noticed the monopoly of this Internet Explorer browser and they themselves launched a lawsuit, which essentially told Microsoft that you must separate out your Internet Explorer from your this Windows business. Okay, so your browser business and your operating system business must be separate, because by bundling your browser inside the operating system, you are killing off companies whose main product is the browser. But I think it didn't work that well, and by the time this was enforced on Microsoft, Netscape had already died. Anyways, 1994, CERN and MIT signed an agreement to set up the World Wide Web Consortium, or W3C. This still exists, and this decide many of the development efforts, guide many of the development efforts, technical specifications, etc. of the modern internet. What is HTML? So probably many of you have a very good, better idea than HTML, because you might have done actual HTML programming to create web sheets, web pages. But I'll still, for those of you who are not very aware, I will still specify it. HTML is hypertext markup language. It's a way to represent web content. It describes the text along with formatting. If you have used LaTeX, okay, for creating documents, the concept is slightly similar. You describe the overall structure of the document, okay, and for individual texts, you have control on deciding the format of the text. For example, whether it should be italics, whether it should be bold font, what should be the size of the text, etc., etc. Okay, so this HTML also works like that for describe the overall structure of the documents. Nowadays, people use style sheets. We will come to it. But essentially, this might be a very, very simple HTML document that is shown. So there are certain starting and ending bracket kind of things. The starting and ending brackets are written in a peculiar way. The starting bracket is some keyword within this angular symbols, okay, smaller than and greater than symbols. And the ending bracket is the corresponding same keyword, but with a slash added. So this sample, there is a header of which the title is the sample. Then there is a body which starts, which is a paragraph, etc., etc. And finally, it must end with /HTML, and because it began with /HTML. Just like in LaTeX, you write begin document and end document. It is something like that. In LaTeX, the delimiters are begin and end with some keyword. Here it is different. Now try to understand how does a web page, what is a web page that you see on a browser? You have to understand that, okay? HTML is not this simple nowadays. Many graphics, other scripts and other information can be embedded inside HTML, okay? CSS, JavaScript, etc. So JavaScript itself by themselves are small code snippets which get executed on the fly by your browser. So your browser has the ability to execute those JavaScript scripts. Now, I will come to what your computer does when you access a web page. But this is an example of the ability of HTML as it has progressed over time. So HTML 1.0 managed only hyperlinks, images, and lists, supported nothing else. But then from HTML 2.0, other things started getting supported. Tables got supported in HTML 3.0, equations got supported, toolbars got supported. Okay, HTML4 style sheets and scripting got supported. Scripting getting supported is a major advancement. Audio and video got supported in HTML5, etc., etc. Now, what happens actually? Okay, so what happens is you make your there is a web browser running on this desktop computer. Okay. So this is the way desktop computers look like in offices, mostly earlier days. Your CPU was actually kept as a horizontal box on which your monitor was kept. This configuration itself has become very rare. Nowadays, the CPUs are kept vertically by the side. But anyways, yeah. So these web browsers, they suppose you want to display a web page, say youtube.com. Okay. You make a it has the ability. So this youtube.com server, it has documents, other programs, a database, etc., everything inside it. Okay, and it can give you this information. So, and if you want to display a web page, relatively simple web page, okay, like say the www.cs.washington.edu, you request the web server of the cs.washington.edu domain, you make a HTTP request to it. How do you make a request? We'll come to it. Okay. You make a request to it, provided your request is I think this might be I think the direction of this text, the labels of these texts might be slightly different. So you make the request and then the web server sends you the response, which is basically the HTML code. Okay, so you request the web page and the web server sends you back the HTML code corresponding to this web page. And your browser parses that code and on the fly renders this web page for you on the screen. Okay. Now, this is the simplest type of web pages. In other type of more complicated websites like say YouTube or say an Amazon shopping, etc. kind of e-shopping, many other complications come in. Okay, some of them is they will send back certain scripts which will be executed by your browser on the client side, and sometimes you fill up a form and submit something which goes back to the server and gets processed there. So both this bidirectional transfer of data is possible. Okay, so they might send you some additional things other than the static web page that is getting displayed. Okay, so that code your browser will directly on the fly execute and give you some additional effects. And in turn, you might also send them some data which they will parse and their server-side programming will be done, and interaction with its database might happen, etc., etc. Now, suppose in the client side, so usually you use a browser. It is possible not to use a browser and directly use raw HTTP, but that is very rarely done. Suppose there is a web page called CSC. There is a server called csc.itkgp.ac.in. Under that, there is a directory called Sandeep C corresponding to faculty, or every faculty has a folder in under this server. Okay. So tilde Sandeep C is the home directory of the faculty Professor Sandeep Chakraborty. Under that folder, there is a page called courses.html. Okay. So the page is called courses.html. The page is located in the server csc.itkgp.ac.in, and the file structure, directory structure is under that server, under the root, under the folder, home folder of Sandeep C. And how can the page be accessed? Using the HTTP protocol. Okay, so this is the entire story. Each page is assigned a complete path, okay, or the name, okay, which shows its path, the protocol, and the machine on which the page is located. This is called a uniform resource locator, or URL. Okay, so the entire URL of this web page is http://csc.itkgp.ac.in, and then the path basically. So : is the way you specify HTTP protocol and separate it out from the server name. So this is a requirement, you have to specify it like that. So when you click, when you type http://csc.itkgp.ac.in /tilde/sandeepc/courses.html, then the browser determines the URL. It asks the local DNS server for the IP address of the server csc.itkgp.ac.in. Suppose the DNS reply is 203.110.245.250. Then the browser makes a TCP connection to this on port 80. Why port 80? Because this is something called a well-known port. All these well-known ports typically are ports which are below 1024. Okay, there are several well-known ports. HTTP, it is known, always uses port 80, so it makes a TCP connection to that machine at that port. These ports are not physical ports. Okay, don't think the port is a hole on the server csc.itkgp.ac.in and somebody magically will go and plug in a wire in that hole, and then you will get a connection. Everything is virtual. Everything is a logical connection. Okay, there is no permanent physical connection between your machine and the csc.itkgp.ac.in server through its port. So I mean, I've actually got this type of queries from beginning students. Sir, what is a port? Is there like how many such holes are there on the server? There is nothing. This port is just a logical identifier of the service that you are requesting. Okay, there is also another identifier, which is the name of the IP address of the server. Similarly, you have a port and you have an IP address. So these four things together form the characterize the connection. Now, because HTTP uses completely unencrypted connectivity, it is not safe. Later on, it has been enhanced to provide secured connectivity using something called TLS, which is or transport layer security, which is integrated into this TCP. And that uses a protocol called HTTPS, the secured version of HTTP that uses port 443. So as you see, this choice of ports is completely ad hoc. Okay. I mean, suddenly HTTPS does not use 81. It uses something like, it doesn't use 79 or 81. It suddenly uses 443. But this is the scenario actually. This is completely randomly chosen most of the times. Anyways, the browser makes a TCP connection to this. It will send an HTTP request asking for the page ~sandipc/courses.html. How it sends the HTTP request, we will study. Or what is the HTTP query? How does it look like? We will study. The csc.itkgp.ac.in server in turn sends the page, web page as the HTTP response. So that's just a stream of information which represents the page. The web page is not sent as its whole. Its representation in HTML is sent. This is something very important for you to understand. Okay. The representation of the page is sent, or the HTML page is sent. How it will look like on your browser depends on how your browser will interpret that HTML page and display it. Okay. Now, if the page includes other URLs that are needed for display, the browser fetches all the other web pages corresponding to those URLs also, till it has got every, it has resolved every URL and it has fetched everything. So this is very important. This connectivity of different documents through one single document is very, very important feature that you do not usually, if you want that resource immediately to be displayed on a web page, for example, a picture, that will be fetched also in the same connection. I mean, your browser in the same session, so that you get the complete web page. It might take some time for the browser to get all the information. That's why slowly the web page loads and it displays fully on your browser. But eventually it will probably get all the resources. An example is that in the HTML file, there some style sheet might be mentioned, which refers to a file called layout.css. Okay, CSS is probably a style description format. Okay, and it is located under the current directory, but under another subdirectory called styles. Under that, a layout.css file is located. That is used as the style description for the rest of the web page. The rest of the web page mostly will define the content and some formatting of some particular text. For example, a header will have this. Then there are some further metadata. Further links with the HTML addresses to which these links point to, the URLs to which these links point to. For example, there is a link Department of Computer Science and Engineering, which is actually probably in hypertext font. So that points to csc.itkgp.arnet.in. Then there is an Indian Institute of Technology, so which is as an embedded URL called http://www.itkgp.ac.in. So all of us, while preparing CVs or preparing documents, have done this. You just select or preparing writing emails have done this. You just select a part of the email or the document and you say that this points to this certain other web page. This is exactly what is meant by this text. Now, it also uses an image. This web page needs an image. The source of the image source is iitkgp.png. This file is required. This is the logo of iitkgp probably. This can be obtained under the directory ~sandipc/images. So this gives, you see, it will give relative paths corresponding to the same folder where the HTML file is located. Currently, the HTML file is itself located under tilde Sandeep C. So from there on, from its current directory, it will give an relative path. So the entire path is tilde Sandeep C / images / iitkgp.png. Your browser will automatically resolve the complete path and get this resource also. And when it displays the web page, you will get the web page displayed with this image embedded in it. Okay. So you don't need to initiate another session to get this image. Okay. However, you can click on this link separately and open another tab in the browser, or in the same browser tab that you were using, you can just click on this iitkgp.ac.in link and it will open. So we can just actually have a look. Let's see if it works. Okay, so say this is Professor Sandeep Chakraborty's web page. At the bottom of the browser, you would not be able to see, but I can see it is already showing that the link to the web page is csc.iitkgp.ac.in /tilde Sandeep C. So I click on this. Clearly, the entire URL is shown here at the top. Okay, and there are many other photos, etc. I think these have been updated later on. So there is something called view page source. I right click on this and it shows a view page source. So this is the view page source thing. There are many images, assets / images / fav.png, Apple Touch icon.png. I don't know what are these, but these themselves are some things that are happening. kgp.png, there is something which is the KGP logo. Okay, teaching, then there are this href, teaching.html. This is a page. So if I click on it and say open in new tab, this will open in a new tab. This is the teaching web page. Okay, so essentially what it shows is that these web pages themselves separately point to other HTML pages. Okay, so which is also shown in the bar below. Okay. So all these things are there. So see this assistant professor, computer science and engineering, all these things are given. Sandeeppeak.jpg is given. Assets, images, banner, sandeeppeak.jpg. Okay, so you can open this in tab and this will show his image which is getting displayed. The point that I was making is when I displayed this web page, it's not that this image, it just showed the URL and again you needed to click on this and then it brought in the image. It rendered the image immediately. Okay, immediately it rendered the image. So this is something that you should understand. Sometimes why it takes time to actually load a web page. What is loading? The web page is loading, we often say, right? Why does it require time to load? Because it is probably getting, these are static resources. These images are static resources, but still they have to be brought. If there are dynamic code snippets that are getting executed by your browser for dynamic web pages, those will take even more time. Okay, so this is the image picture that I was talking of. This has been brought from this IIT KGP logo somewhere. This kgp.png is this image. And the style sheet that is getting used is I think this relative link is asset slash CSS front, awesome, mean CSS, flat icon, bootstrap, mean animate, all different CSS. I think this one. These are plugin CSS, favicon and touch icons, this favicon directory. Okay, another important thing that I should mention is that because your display device does not the browsers in your display device do not always interpret the HTML code in the same way, particularly if your display devices vary widely in their resolutions and all these other features. Many websites make different HTML versions of the same web page for different target devices. For example, you might find a banking website which is customized for mobile phones, smartphones, and something which is customized for PCs or tabs. Okay, so this is very common. So in that case, detecting, they will have two versions of the same web page and they will tell you that depending on your device you select. I have seen that the IIT KGP, the ERP particularly does not, well, it displays, but it doesn't always work very well with smartphones. It doesn't always display also properly with smartphones because it has been made targeting probably computers with larger display dimensions, okay, like laptops or tabs or desktops. So there is no mobile smartphone version of that same web page. So the browser cannot render this properly when it tries to render. Okay. So let's continue. So the moral of the story is that web pages are displayed based on what has been given in the HTML documents. Okay. And those usually can be retrieved using the HTTP or HTTPS application layer protocols by your applications like browsers from remote servers and then displayed locally on your browsers. Okay, by interpreting the code that is there for HTML, okay, it displays the web page on your browser. All the resources that are linked that has to be brought in immediately are immediately brought in. Those links which do not need to be brought in immediately, they are kept as links. You can separately click on them and access them later on. Okay. Now, what happens when the browser displays the page courses.html? The TCP connections are usually released if there are no other requests to the same server for a short time. This is fine, but there was one problem. Okay, so that how the connections behave is important to understand. HTTP uses TCP to set up a connection between the server, and the HTTP server runs at port 80, listening to different connection incoming requests, or port 8080 also sometimes, I mean alternate. Now in HTTP 1.0, once the connection was established, a single request for a HTML page was sent. The HTML page was sent back and immediately the TCP connection was released from the server side and the client side. Okay, so there is a handshaking that goes on when the connection is released. Also, it is not very easy. Okay, it has several steps and a handshaking goes on and only then it is released. Okay, so what this means was that separate connections are needed for every content in the web page. Okay, and the overhead is very, very high. Okay, so like that figure needed to be displayed, right? So there will be one connection from the first HTML page, one TCP connection. But after that HTML page source code comes, page is not yet fully displayed, but the TCP connection in the meantime will get released. Again, your browser will have to initiate another TCP connection. Why? To get that image, because it has not yet been able to fully display the web page. So it was painfully slow and it was horrible wastage of resources, because initiating and terminating TCP connection themselves are quite complicated tasks. This was very wasteful. Overhead was very high. So in HTTP 1.1, they said we'll start with persistent connections. What is persistent connection? It sends additional requests and additional responses in a single TCP connection. Okay, and another request will be sent, the HTTP request will be sent. Please send me this image, and they will send back the image. But the connection is the same. It is still there. Okay, it is like this. You are calling your friend. You first dial his number. He picks up the phone. You say, hello, are you my friend? He says, yes, I am your friend, and immediately he disconnects. Again, you call. Friend, are you coming to the party tonight? Yes, I will come. Again, disconnect. Again, you connect. Friend, the party will start at 8 p.m. Okay, 8 p.m. is fine. Oh, no, 8 p.m. is not fine. And then he hangs up again. Again, you call. Oh, 8 p.m. is not fine. What is your convenient time? Your friend says, I cannot come before 9 p.m. Okay, again he hangs up. So after every sentence he is hanging up. That's not how conversations work, right? And that is immensely wasteful, because every time you are trying to set up a connection, there is an overhead. So HTML 1.0 was like that. That fortunately very quickly they understood. They got rid of it, and they allowed persistent connections, that for a time you allow the connections. Now for a long time, all the resources that were needed to render the web page has been brought back. Till for a time there is no other display of anything, or there is no transaction between the two computers, then okay, then you get rid of the TCP connection. So that sort of TCP timers are there in ordinary other TCP connections also. We will see later. Now, it is also interesting that additionally, it is also possible to pipeline requests. So what is pipelining request is slightly, I mean, it is quite intuitive, but still probably I will describe it with some care. So look at this timing diagram. Okay, get used to this type of timing diagrams. For the rest of the course, we will be using this type of timing diagrams very, very often. Okay. In computer networks, timing diagrams usually show the time axis vertically going from top to bottom. This is peculiar, and you have to get used to it, because this is how all textbooks and papers describe events. Okay, so this is quite unusual. In other subjects, probably you expect the time axis to be the horizontal axis, not here. Okay, so this diagram is not wrong. This is how it will be represented. When you have to answer questions or analyze some connections, you will also need to draw similar timing diagrams with vertical time axis. So first, let us concentrate on HTTP 1.0. Okay, in HTTP 1.0, what happened was that there is a connection setup. Okay, that connection setup takes some time. Then there is a HTTP request, and then the corresponding HTTP response is this entire response in shaded form. This shows that the request takes much less time and there is only one request. Just send me courses.html, something like that. Whereas the HTTP response is much more substantial. It is sending back a large HTML page. Okay, so it is taking much more information. Notice how the arrows are not horizontally straight. The arrows are slightly tilting downwards to show that time has passed. When the HTTP request was made and when the HTTP request was received at the server, some small amount of time had passed because these HTTP requests themselves need to be transmitted over the network, which cannot happen in zero time. It will take some time. More time is required to transfer the HTML information over the network back to this guy, the requester. But immediately after the initial HTML information is set, immediately it is disconnected. But then the browser finds that, well, there are certain figures, other resources which have still not been obtained. Again, it sets up a connection and requests, please send me this figure. Again, it sends this figure, say the IIT Kharagpur KGP logo. Again, it disconnects. Automatically, after one response, it will be disconnected. Then you say, this faculty's image, there are four other images. I need them also. Again, it requests one image. Please send me this image. Again, it sends and then again disconnects. In this way, this continues terribly slowly and terribly wastefully. Now, in persistent HTTP 1.1, what happened? I mean, HTTP 1.1 has been introduced long back. So what happened was, after the connection setup happened, immediately the connection is not disconnected. In this entire diagram, connection has not been disconnected even once. Okay. On the left hand side diagram, at this dotted line boundaries, connection disconnection and connection setup has happened. Okay. Now in this middle diagram, once connection was set up at the top or the beginning, top is the beginning of in the time. Okay. Then this continues and notice that there has been no further connection setup. So with one connection setup, you can transfer so much of data. The right hand side is called persistent with pipelining. What is persistent with pipelining? Pipelining, you know, is, those of you who have taken computer architecture, pipelining is a method by which you overlap instruction execution. Okay, without waiting for one instruction to finish, you start pushing in the execution, pushing in another instruction into the CPU and asking it to execute it. So there are partially executed instructions filling up something called a pipeline inside a CPU. There might be 5-stage pipeline, which means there are 5 partially executed instructions. And at the end of every clock cycle, if everything goes well, you will get one instruction completed, guaranteed, at every clock cycle. Okay. Now the pipeline connection is something similar. If you notice the middle HTTP 1.1 persistent connection, notice that here one request was made, the corresponding data was sent, then another request was made. The connection was still there, but then repeated requests were not superimposed on one another. Okay, one request, then some stuff comes, then the next request, then some stuff comes, etc. In the persistent pipeline, persistent version, even the requests are superimposed on one another. So basically the server is bombarded with requests one after the other. And even before the server has been able to give back the complete query, complete answer to one of the requests, the other request has come. That is fine. The server will queue this next request, and when it finishes with the first sending back stuff corresponding to the first request, it starts sending back stuff corresponding to the second request. Why is this more efficient? Well, if you look at the middle timing diagram, notice that after the first request was fulfilled by the server, when the connection sent the second request, in between, in this large white time period in between, when the client sent the second request, sorry, in between, in this white time period, the server was not doing anything. Okay, it was sitting idle. That will not happen in this pipeline requests. The server will not sit idle. It will work very fast, very busily, and it will finish the entire transaction quite fast compared to the simple persistent connection with no pipelining. Okay. Do you understand the difference, students? Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, sir.
Okay. So get used to this type of timing diagrams. This will be required in the rest of the course. Now, how does a server work? When you request a server for something, it accepts the TCP connection from a client, that is a browser running on your computer, the local computer. It gets the path to the page, which is the same name of the file requested. It gets the file from the disk. Hopefully the file is there, and it sends the contents of the file, which is probably HTML. It can be something else also, but we are considering HTML, to the client, and it closes the TCP connection. Whether it will close immediately or not, whether it will be persistent, whether it will be pipeline persistent, we have just now discussed. There are several choices. Now, please try to understand. Again, this is something which is very important, and in those of you who are in the lab will do this very intensely. The server does not, busy servers, okay, common servers like say google.com, even say iitkgp.ac.in, some banking, online banking servers, railway reservation servers, okay, travel website servers, airlines or reservation, railways reservation, all this type of stuff. Common websites which provide public facilities, some public services. They do not serve one client at a time. They serve millions of clients at a time. Now you have to understand how this is done. First of all, a server is a name that represents a physical computer that is waiting to hear from other clients about connection requests and to provide the necessary information when it is asked for. But a server is also the name for the process that is running on that physical computer, which is waiting at port 80, or in case of HTTP, and in some other ports for other services, which is waiting at these ports and waiting for these services to be fulfilled on behalf of other clients. It is said that the HTTP server process will keep listening at port 80. There are several background processes usually which start immediately when you boot your computer. These background processes, there can be several background processes, but some of them keep listening to well-known network ports because they represent different network functionalities. For example, file transfer, FTP, HTTP connections, etc., etc. Okay. This type of background processes which keep on running in the background without disturbing you, but which provide very essential services to the user are called daemons, D-A-E-M-O-N. Okay. So these daemons typically always keep running in the background. You can, with super user privilege, you can go in and kill these daemon processes, but that's not advisable, because if you kill, say, the HTTP daemon process, then your server would not be able to accept incoming requests at port 80. Again, the port 80 is not a physical port, okay? There is only one connection to your computer, either through a wireless module or through a socket Ethernet cable that plugs into your computer at the back. So that's a single point for all network connectivity. That is given. The question is, what is this port concept? Can you please hold for a moment? Just give me a moment. I'll just come back. Sorry. So your daemon server daemon process is kind of executing at a known port. What basically means that that daemon process only responds to connection requests which specifies that port number, port 80, say, for example. Okay, fine. So your HTTP daemon process, server process, is running. One computer on a server, your computer, say the client computer, requests an HTTP request is made to the server. The server process will now initiate a connection, TCP connection. I shouldn't say HTTP process. I should probably say the TCP connection requesting connection process. I should, so probably to be proper. It will initiate a TCP connection between your machine and itself by cloning itself. Basically, by creating a, earlier it used to be a complete clone of itself. So if you have taken operating system and you will be taking, probably, or you are already taking, there is a parent process, and from parent process, child processes can be forked. Child processes can be created. So from a parent process, you create a child process, a copy of itself, and ask that child process that please handle this new request. In the meantime, I will go back listening to this port for new incoming requests. However, in modern systems, this parent process, child process creation based server duplication is possible, but more common is another thread is created. This new thread goes and handles the new connection request, whereas the actual parent process keeps on listening to the port. Okay, and then these threads handle different connections. It can even happen that from your computer multiple connection requests are made to the server, then those might get handled using different threads. That is also possible. Okay, each of these threads can share a different server cache. This cache is not always what we mean by cache memory of a microprocessor. It is a relatively fast memory from which it can get information that already had been retrieved from its disk. Maybe it's just memory. Okay, memory in this case might be large memory, might also be called cache. And all these threads continuously work and give services to this individual clients. When the client process is done, that thread terminates, but the parent server process keeps on running and the other threads are also not disturbed. Okay, they also keep running. This is how it works, and this feature of a server that it can handle multiple clients simultaneously is crucial. Otherwise, we would not have been able to do anything useful, at least not on the internet. Okay. For simple applications where you want to connect to one, you have two computers, one at home and one in your office. Okay, you come back from your office to your home and then you suddenly remember, oh, I need to connect back to my office computer because I need this document. I had left it in my office computer. Or the reverse, you come to office, you say, oh, last night I was editing my this thing on my home computer and I need this document immediately. Those things is only one-to-one process because only you will be using your office computer and only you will be using your home computer. Okay. So that is not the case with common web servers, which handle millions and millions of client processes and physical clients every second. Fine. Now let's come to HTTP. HTTP requests use several commands. Okay. Some of the commands are written on the right, they're listed on the right. These are called methods. Some of the common methods are get, head, post, put, delete, trace, connect, options, etc. So these, what do these commands do is also given in the table. So get is supposed to read a web page, head is supposed to read a web page's header only, post is supposed to append to a web page. Of course, you need to be allowed to post that. Okay, so the post method is used. Can you give me an example where you might use the post method to append data to a web page and send it back to the server?
Form submission or Facebook post.
Yes, form submission. Very good. Okay. Delete, remove the web page. Of course, the server should allow you to remove the web page. Otherwise, you cannot remove. So these are probably quite rare. But the post method is very, very important. Okay, this allows form submissions. When you fill up a HTML form, I don't know whether you have ever noticed the parameters that you fill up, those the values that you fill up, they are paired with the parameters corresponding to the filled up values. And they are connected using ampersand and a long list is then when you submit the form, that is actually sent back to the server. And it is said that you have posted this to the server. You have sent back the web page, but now with some additional information. Okay, or you have posted a message to the server. You don't need to send back the entire web page. Sorry, you just form a well-structured message with the list of parameter value, this kind of a long string, and you send it back to the server. On the server side, typically there are these I mean, Python used to be, sorry, Perl used to be very, very common. So there is something called CGI, Common Gateway Interface. CGI scripting using the Perl programming language was very common, which would take this type of information that is coming in and to parse them and process this information. Perl is a language which is excellent for parsing strings, okay, parsing text. So they used to take advantage of that language for CGI scripting. So that is server side programming basically. Now, when you say you send HTTP request get file name HTTP/1.1, this basically means that HTTP version 1.1 will be used and the file name you will give. Then there is a request line. Okay, the kind of an some first line is just some metadata. Then there is this header value pairs. Okay, header field name and value. Header field name value, one on each line is given. And then there is a CRLF at the end of every line. What is CRLF? CR is carriage return and LF is line feed. Carriage return basically means you bring back the cursor to the beginning of the line. Okay. And line feed means go to the next line. So overall, these two together means you press an enter. Basically, the same effect that happens when you press an enter in a document is combination of carriage return line feed. Okay. So these things are sent. Finally, there is an entity body. You don't need to memorize these things. Just remember that the header, this field name and the value pairs, these are sent in messages. So the header fields, there can be many others, many fields. One of the important one is if modified since. If modified since is an important flag. What happens is that it might happen that your computer has access, say www.google.com recently. When your computer accesses such a web page, it caches it. Locally, it had got the HTML code and it had rendered it. You saw it, you used it. But that HTML information is kept in your local cache on your local computer. In cases of proxy servers, which was in widespread use in IIT Kharagpur, okay, which is still probably in use for the student accesses, I don't know. There, the proxy server performs this caching. The basic usage of proxy server is actually caching web pages. That was the classical use. However, they can also be used to implement filters and access control policies as it is used in most places. IIT Kharagpur also uses it. So through a if modified since header, it tells the server, you send me back the page. See, it's basically telling the server, see, I already have a copy of that web page corresponding to that URL. Now, you send me the web page if it has been modified since this time, because the copy I have was retrieved at this time. And since then, if you have modified it, please send me back the new page. Otherwise, please reply back with a short answer saying, no, it has not been modified. You don't need to send me back the entire HTML page with all the associated other resources like pictures and diagrams and everything. So that saves bandwidth. That saves bandwidth a lot. Okay. So it takes advantage of the caching when it is not sure whether it needs a newer version of the web page or not. Most web pages do not change that frequently. Other than web pages like Twitter and all these things, these are called dynamic web pages, where you perform some action which changes the look and feel of the web page immediately. Okay, so these dynamic web pages usually will not be cached. Dynamic web pages are not cached. But for static web pages, which is the most other web pages like that faculty web page we saw, our departmental web page, those do not need to be retrieved every time once you have received it. Okay. Now this HTTP response, it sends back some response also corresponding to the values that are requested. Now in the header there is a code usually. This code are usually numbers starting from 100, 3-digit numbers. Most commonly are those with starting with 1. This is some information. 2, that this is a success. 3, there has to be redirected. Okay, 304 is saying the cached page you have is still valid. Don't worry. 301 is page moved, so something you will be either be automatically redirected or you will need to redirect yourself based on information I'm providing. Client error, forbidden page. You are trying to access a forbidden page. 404 is almost, it has become like a colloquial term. Page not found. Okay, HTTP error 404, page not found. Your browser displays it. It has become a very common terminology, but this is what it means. This is where it comes from. And server error is, there has been 5, the class 5 codes are that there is an internal server error, or please try again later. For some reason the server could not reply to your query, etc. Now, when your browser finally receives back this code via HTTP, it usually displays the code it received, and it also displays the corresponding string. For example, 404 page not found. Okay, so this will, it will receive, it will display to the user to tell what happened. So this last modified information is very important. Okay, date and time, the last web page was changed, when the web page expires, when it will stop being valid. These are all sent back as responses and noted down by the client. In the cached web pages, these are noted down, so that if it checks the cached web page first and finds that the page has already expired, it will get the new web page from the server. However, if it sees the cached web page and finds that the web page is still going to be valid for the next 1 year, it is guaranteed to be valid, then it fetches that web page and uses it. Anyways, local browser caches are also cleared periodically. Either you can clear history, basically, which clears cache, and it can also probably be cleared. It can be cleared manually, or also might be cleared automatically if your local web cache becomes full. Now there is something called a cookie. Okay, so there is a response called set cookie. We will come to now what is the cookie. Okay, first of all, let's see this caching thing. So it checks for the expiry of page. If it is still not expired, it gets the response. It can do a conditional get. For example, it will send get with a particular field saying that please send me back the web page only if I have a copy of the web page which is only if you have modified it. Okay, it has expired. My local web cache page has expired. Okay, but if you maybe you have not modified it, only you send me back the web page only if you have modified it, and if when it says not modified, it still uses the cache page. Otherwise, it sends back the response, and that is used. Dynamic web applications, basically dynamically the web pages are changed. There are both server-side programs and client-side programs in the browsers which dynamically change the look and feel of the web pages. And this type of pages usually are never cached. Now let's come to cookies. Okay, this is very interesting concept. All of us have used it. Maybe you have not paid attention. So for those of you who have not paid attention to this, now please try to relate your experience with this concept. A cookie is a small piece of information which identifies a particular client, your computer, to a server. As such, HTTP is a stateless protocol. Every response to a particular request, it is only relevant to that response. It does not remember anything about who made this response, for how long should I remember who made this response, etc. Okay, what was the last page that was accessed by this client, etc. Now, when the client makes a request to a server, the server sends back the necessary information, but it also sends a set cookie value in its HTTP packet. The set cookie value is usually a small session ID number like this 12345. This is stored in the client side. So your client has to allow this cookie to be set. Usually modern browsers will pop up a message. Do you want to set a cookie? You say yes, only then this set cookie command will be effective and a small piece of information will be set on your computer. Later on, when you again try to connect to the server, you will send back your session ID, this information that was sent on your site along with the connection request, along with the HTTP request. In that case, the server identifies, oh, okay, this is this guy, this old client who earlier logged into me and did so many other things. So it customizes the experience of that client when it sends back the response. And prime example is if you add things to a shopping cart in say Amazon or Flipkart and you are not logged in, okay, you just add certain stuff and you then go to some other web page. You go out of that web page or maybe close that web page and go to some other web page. After half an hour, you again log into Amazon, you might find your cart is still filled up with the last choices you made. How is it remembering? You have not logged in. You log into Amazon through your account, then add something in your cart and it remembers, shopping cart, and it remembers. That is understandable. Okay, that is okay. That there is an account and corresponding to it there is a cart. It remembers the choices you made is understandable. But you have not logged into an account, but it is still remembering what stuff is there in that cart. Okay, how is this possible? This is only possible because it knows who is logging into it again. From the identifier of your client, the server can figure out that, oh, you are again coming back after half an hour to me. Okay, then I will show you the last state of your cart just to facilitate your experience. And you will be happy, oh, they have remembered what I chose, and you will proceed from there. Now, many people are not happy about this cookie thing because they say that this is basically eavesdropping on my privacy. Why should a server set information on my local computer? Which is true in a sense that there is value to the argument. So many people are not happy about it, but cookies are in widespread use. But usually browsers, modern browsers ask for your permission before setting a cookie, saying that the cookie will enhance your user experience. Do you want to set it or not? If you say no, then it will not set a cookie. Otherwise, it will set a cookie. There is also an option to delete all cookies when you are clearing your browser cache. Either you can select to delete only the history and no cookies, or you can select to delete both cookies and browse cache pages. Okay, so this is how cookies work. Proxy servers we will come to next day. Thank you very much. I am now stopping the recording.